I wake up before the sun lifts itself over the maples behind my back porch, because at my age, sleep is a visitor that leaves early and forgets its hat. And the house in Riverside, just outside Dayton, is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, like a held breath. I shuffle into the kitchen where the old percolator that my wife swore was plain ugly but indestructible still does its sputtering ritual, and while it coughs, I take down the blue mug my son gave me on the day he graduated law school, the one that says, "Best Dad, case closed," and I stand there with my palm over the chipped rim, remembering how he laughed when the tassel smacked him in the eye and how I told him a silly thing about every victory drawing blood, and I let the memory work through me the way warm water moves through old pipes. The radio by the bread box never leaves the AM band anymore. I listen to farm reports and talk shows where hosts pronounce certainty like a sacrament, then the local weather, which concerns itself mostly with humidity and high school football games. I butter toast with the same thin patience with which I graded essays for 37 years. And as I chew, I look out at the backyard that has a stump where an ash tree used to stand before the Beatles took it, and I tell myself I will call the man with the stump grinder, though I know I'll put it off, because when you've spent half a century making lists and watching other people's lives arrive at their appointments, you earn the right to be late to your own chores. The refrigerator hums like something trying to remember a tune. The wall clock ticks in that old, authoritative way, and between those two sounds I sometimes catch the whisper of my wife's slippers on linoleum, though she has been gone 6 years this July. On Sundays I sit in her pew at St. Michael's, where the light falls through the same stained glass that watched me propose in the church parking lot, with a ring that left a green band on her finger for a week, and afterwards the Knights of Columbus fry pancakes in a cloud of butter, and talk about grandchildren and lawn care, and I nod a lot because it's easier than explaining that I live in a house filled with photographs of a family that seems to exist only inside those frames. When I finish my coffee, I rinse the mug, wipe the counter, and take my walk up to the corner where Lyndale becomes Riverside Drive, passing the Goodman place with the porch swing that never stops swaying even when no one sits in it, and I wave to Dolores, who sets out her garbage cans at the same angle every Wednesday because consistency is how you tell time after the calendar stops making promises. Sometimes she hands me a paper sack of oatmeal cookies and says, "I look thin," and I tell her, "The teaching made me this way because all those years I carried other people's worries home like extra textbooks." The house itself is a museum of my small decisions and my wife's larger kindnesses. The crocheted throw that never matched anything but kept everyone warm. The bulletin board by the back door that still holds a shopping list for a Sunday roast. We never cooked because she took ill on a Friday and never came back to the kitchen. The shoebox of letters from when our son Daniel was still Danny and wrote with block letters about dinosaurs and spelling tests. There is a habit I have of straightening the diploma I paid for twice, once with money and once with the patient years of believing in a boy who wanted to flee this town like it had insulted him personally. And if you stand in my hallway and close your eyes, you can hear the baseball card spokes clacking against his bike tires, the slam of the screen door when he came home sweaty and indignant about some playground politics that would, in time, become the backbone of his appetite for law. I remember how we took his acceptance letter to Ohio State Law and pinned it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow, and my wife cried at the sink in that soft way that turns a kitchen into a chapel. I sold the second car, cashed out a certificate of deposit I'd been sitting on since the year of the blizzard, and we covered the first semester without blinking, because blink and you miss a boy becoming a man. Blink, and you miss the moment he looks over his shoulder and still needs you. There were late-night calls about constitutional law and professors who wore sweaters year-round, and there were rent checks mailed a day early because a landlord had a temper, and there were pep talks about keeping his head down in internships where partners didn't remember names unless there was an error to attach to them. I mailed him a winter coat with its lining, warm enough for the walk from the library to the bus stop, tucked $20 bills into its inside pocket the way my father once did with me, and I sent him a note that said, "If you run out of cash, you never run out of me," which is the kind of sentence that embarrasses a young man until the winter wind makes grown-ups of all of us. When he graduated, we sat on metal folding chairs and heard speeches about justice, and I applauded until the meat of my hands ached. Then we went to a diner, and he ordered pie for the table because success is sweet, only when you share it, and he said he would buy us a better house one day, a place without drafty windows and a driveway that didn't heave up every spring like a scar. I told him we were fine where we were, and he said that was the problem with me, that I may do too easily, that I folded into the shape of circumstances, and I smiled because in those days even his criticism felt like attention. And after he moved to Cincinnati to join a firm with a reception desk made of stone and a view of the river, we visited on holidays, and he came home for Thanksgiving when he could, and when he couldn't, he called on speakerphone while his wife Kelsey stirred gravy with the kind of brisk competence that sets a tone in a room. In the years since my wife's funeral, the visits have thinned the way hair does, slowly at first and then unmistakably. And I learned to measure the seasons not by holidays, but by the practical errands that keep a man from losing his shape. The oil. Change with the mechanic who still prints receipts on that curly paper that fades to ghosts if you leave it in a hot glove compartment. The twice-yearly dental cleaning where the hygienist makes polite conversation about television shows I pretend to watch. The pharmacy pickup where the young tech calls me sir, in a way that is both respectful and faintly startled, as if time has confused all of us. Social Security lands with a soft thud in the checking account at the start of each month. The pension from the district follows, and with them comes the solemn satisfaction of paying the utility bill early and slipping a little extra on the principal of the mortgage. I refinanced into something manageable because a fixed-rate payment is a kind of friend. My days are made of rituals that prevent the house from closing its jaws around me. A mid-morning drive down to the hardware store where the aisles smell like dust and optimism. A stop at the library where Miss Angela at the front desk pretends she doesn't notice that I still call the catalog the card file. A late afternoon shuffle through the shed where my wife kept her gardening tools, every handle smoothed by her grip like a prayer bead. If loneliness were visible, it would look like this neighborhood at dusk. Porch lights blooming in sequence, the air cooling enough to carry voices from block to block, fathers telling small boys to watch their feet on the steps, mothers singing the names of children as if they were incantations against disappearing. I stand on my porch and nod at the headlines on the free community paper, then go back inside before the lamps in other windows make me feel like an audience member to a play. I'm no longer in. The pictures on my mantel, Daniel in a T-ball uniform with grass-stained knees, Daniel in an oversized suit for his first internship, Daniel holding his daughter for the first time with an expression that tore me open with pride. Watch me as I do the dishes and fold laundry and put 2 pork chops in the freezer because cooking for one is a lesson in subtraction. And I keep telling myself that distance is a phase, that careers eat time and children eat attention, and that the heart grows patient. If you give it chores, when the phone rings, it is usually a courtesy call about extended warranties or a recorded voice reminding me of a dental appointment, but sometimes it is Daniel with his voice all business, even when he says, "Hey, Dad?" And I put the receiver against my ear like a seashell to catch the old tide of us. On those calls, I keep my sentences soft and long because I have learned that interruptions are the currency of busy people, and if I am generous with silence, he might pour more of himself into it. And when he does, I hear a man who has built a life that runs on schedules and associations, who knows cocktails by their proper names, and has opinions about neighborhoods and cities I don't visit, and I tell him to get some rest, to eat something. Green once in a while, to kiss the kids for me, even if the kids are already asleep or at a friend's house or shrugging off the hug because they're at the age where affection is a costume they'll put back on later. At night I sit by the window and watch the river of headlights on Route 4, and I think about the word family, how it used to mean all the names at my table and now seems to mean a doorbell. I press and step back from, waiting to be let in, I tell myself I am not a burden, I am a history, and histories deserve readers. But sometimes the truth feels more like a draft you tuck in a drawer and promise to revisit when your calendar clears, and until it does, I carry on with my patient chores, because even a lonely house runs better when someone believes it can. The call came on an afternoon when the light outside had that strange copper tint, as though the sky could not decide between rain and fire, and I remember, because I had been dozing in my recliner with the newspaper folded over my chest, my glasses slipping down my nose when the phone rang and jolted me back into the reality of the empty house. It was Daniel, my son, and though his voice carried that calm, lawyerly cadence he always puts on as if addressing a jury, there was an edge underneath, a kind of impatience that seemed to grow sharper the longer he spoke. He asked how I was, and before I could answer properly, he steered the conversation, almost as though he had rehearsed it, into a question that was not a question at all, but a demand wrapped in polite language. Would I consider selling the house? My house, the place where I had lived with his mother for nearly half a century. He said the market was favorable, that it would be foolish to let an asset of that value sit idle, when the equity could be released and put to work, perhaps in a new investment he was exploring with colleagues. He spoke about opportunity, about growth, about leveraging assets, and I listened in silence because I recognized that he was not really speaking to me as a son, but as if to a client, and there was nothing tender in it. When I told him quietly that the house was not simply an asset, but the place where his mother's presence still lingered in every corner, where her perfume still clung to the folds of the curtains, where the gardens she had coaxed into bloom each spring still pushed up tulips without her hands, he sighed, the way a man sighs when the other side refuses to settle, and he reminded me that clinging to memories could be unhealthy, that I was not getting any younger, and that at some point I would need to consider long-term care. His voice hardened when I resisted, and then the sentence came, quick and cold. If you won't do this, Dad, then don't expect me to come running when you need help later. Don't put yourself in a position where you'll have no one to lean on. The words hit me harder than he could have known, because for years I had leaned only on myself, refusing to burden him, refusing to ask for more than a phone call or a weekend visit. And here he was turning that restraint into a weapon, suggesting that if I did not give him what he wanted, I would forfeit the very thing I had never dared to ask. I tried to remind him that his mother and I had sacrificed for his education, that we had carried him through lean years with the belief that one day he would stand taller than us and extend his hand back. But he brushed it aside, saying that was the past, that life was about forward motion, and that sentimentality was the enemy of progress. He told me he and Kelsey had talked it through, and that she agreed the house was wasted on me, a single old man with too many ghosts rattling around in empty rooms, and that if I truly loved him and his family, I would release this place and allow something new to be built. When I told him no, when I said the house would remain mine as long as I drew breath, there was a silence so long and so complete that I wondered if he had hung up. But then he spoke again, and this time the mask slipped. You're making a mistake, and don't expect me to fix it for you. If you choose the house over us, then you'll have to live with that choice. His voice cracked with anger on the last word, and before I could answer, the line went dead. I sat with the receiver still warm against my ear, listening to the hollow tone, and felt a slow heaviness fill my chest, heavier than grief, heavier than anger, something like the weight of being quietly disowned by the only person left who should have stood beside me. That night I walked through the rooms, touching the edges of photographs and furniture as though to reassure myself that they were still mine, and I thought about how the very thing that had been built for family had now become the wedge driving us. Apartment. The catalyst was not just a request to sell, but a declaration that blood could be priced, that a father could be measured in dollars and square footage, and that refusing to yield meant risking exile from the circle of his life. It was then that I understood something irreversible had shifted, and though the words, "You are not family anymore," had not yet been spoken aloud, I could hear them coming, sharp as the click of a closing door. The first week after that call, I told myself it was a misunderstanding born of stress and deadlines, that Daniel had simply chosen the wrong day and the wrong words, and that if I let the air settle, the dust of anger would fall where it belonged. But silence has a way of reorganizing a house, and the days moved past with that hollow scooped-out feeling until Kelsey texted to say they would stop by on Saturday for a quick check-in, which made me feel like a piece of equipment that required periodic maintenance rather than a man, and I spent the morning putting the good quilt on the couch and setting out the mug with the gold rim that had been my wife's favorite, because hospitality was a habit she taught me, and I am slow to unlearn. They arrived late and breezy, bringing nothing but a draft of professional air that chilled the rooms, and while I hugged my grandchildren, Maya stiff as a board because 13 is made of angles and armor, Luke buried in a hoodie that smelled of some cologne that promises invincibility, Daniel stayed by the doorway and looked around as if squinting at a property he was appraising, and Kelsey set her tote on the dining table and began to talk about next steps with a light managerial tone that made me think of staff meetings and action items. She said they had found a wonderful community 20 minutes from their place, independent living with a shuttle to appointments and a bistro that serves salmon on Fridays, and I laughed more sharply than I meant to and told her the bistro in my kitchen served pork chops and memories, and Daniel frowned in that way he has when he believes the other party is being unreasonable and asked me not to make this difficult, as though difficulty were something I had chosen like a shirt that morning. It became clear that they had rehearsed, because every sentence braided into the next without the friction of improvisation. Kelsey praised the safety features. Daniel mentioned a tax advantage to selling before the end of the year. Kelsey nodded toward the staircase and said she worried about my knees. Daniel said the market wouldn't stay hot forever. And then, like a magician pretending to be casual, he produced a thin folder from his briefcase with printouts clipped just so. Amortization. Tables and a neat summary that translated 4 rooms and a garden into neat columns of numbers. When I didn't reach for it, he set it down next to the bowl of apples, and I saw our reflections wobble in the polished table. An older man in a cardigan, trying not to betray his pulse, a son who kept smoothing his tie, and a daughter-in-law who had the expression of someone drawing a bowstring and waiting for the moment to let go. I went to the kitchen to take a pie from the oven because I had promised myself I would host them properly no matter what. And while I was cutting slices, I heard Kelsey tell Maya to help Grandpa find his glasses because he misplaces them. And something in me flinched because my glasses were in my breast pocket and I had not misplaced them in years, not once. And it occurred to me that a story had begun to be written about me without my consent, a small fable of absent-mindedness and fragility that would, if told enough times, become the kind of truth that blocks doors. We ate at the dining table under the lamp with the yellow shade, and Daniel asked Luke about soccer and Maya about a science fair, and then, as if casually, asked me if I was still paying my insurance through the old auto draft because his friend from the firm, great guy, dead, really thorough, could review my files to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. When I told him that after a lifetime of grading papers I could still read a policy and set a reminder, he chuckled and said, "Not everyone." Liked paperwork as much as I did, and Kelsey reached across to straighten my knife and whispered that routines are good until they become traps. And I found myself suddenly exhausted by being treated like a child who had cornered himself in a fortress built of habits. After dessert, Kelsey stood and started stacking plates with a burst of helpfulness that felt less like service and more like a friendly takeover. And when she returned from the kitchen, she paused by the credenza and opened the bottom drawer and said, "Oh, this must be the photo albums." And before I could speak, she slid one out, the blue leather one with the loose spine, the one that begins with our wedding and ends with Daniel holding Maya in a blanket that my wife crocheted. And she told Maya to bring it out to the car because the humidity in old houses is murder on paper, and she knew a place that would digitize the pictures for me, and the intention might have been a kindness, if not for the speed with which it happened and the way her fingers were already at the corners of my life, prying gently yet insistently. So I stood and took the album back with a care that surprised me with its firmness, and said that memories here are already digitized in me. And Daniel gave me a look that said this was exactly the sort of sentimental obstruction he had predicted. From that day, a series of small misalignments began to multiply like hairline cracks that only reveal the spider web of damage when sunlight hits at a low angle. Appointments I thought we had made were somehow tentative on their calendars, Call's eye. Made in the late afternoon went to voicemail on the grounds of dinner with clients. Invitations to Luke's games arrived after the fact with sincere apologies attached. And when I did catch them at home, Maya waved from the staircase without coming. Down, and Luke pretended not to hear me because a headset is armor against inconvenient voices. I told myself everyone is busy, but busy can also be a structure built to exclude. And on a Sunday, when I decided to drive to Cincinnati with a container of beef stew, because cooking for people is how I strike a match against the dark, I was greeted at their building by a lobby with a concierge who asked me to wait while he checked if they were home, which felt like applying for permission to belong. To my own blood, and when the elevator finally brought them down 30 minutes later, Daniel was in athleisure and Kelsey had her phone in one hand, and they smiled as if to an elderly neighbor who had dropped by with mail, and Kelsey said how thoughtful and how unexpected, and I said I had texted, and she said the message must not have gone through, and I stood there with the warm weight of stew pressing into my palms like an awkward gift from another century. They invited me upstairs for a minute, and a minute was exactly what I got, the time it takes for a person to remain polite without rearranging the afternoon. I put the stew in their refrigerator and saw that a magnet shaped like a sailboat held a family calendar full of arrows and highlighted blocks, and the word strategy written twice in Daniel's block letters, and Kelsey, as if remembering the script, suggested that while I was there, we might as well meet someone who could help us. Organize things so that everyone slept better at night, and out of the guest room stepped a man with a hand like a shovel and a smile made entirely of teeth, who introduced himself as Tom and described himself as a financial wellness advisor, and I understood as clearly as if a spotlight had snapped on that this casual Sunday had been wired from the start. Tom talked about consolidating accounts to reduce cognitive load and about durable power of attorney being a gift to the future, and he had a pen ready that glinted like a lure, and though I remained on the couch with my coat still on, he drifted closer and placed a packet on the coffee table with comforting tabs and soft blues and greens, and said we could take things step by step, no pressure. And Daniel sat opposite with his elbows on his knees and his hands steepled, and told me he only wanted to be positioned to help when the time came, which would have sounded like love if he had not set a deadline for it earlier that week. I told Tom thank you, and that I would bring my documents to my own attorney for review because old teachers have a superstition about handing in work early to the wrong desk, and Tom's smile held, but his eyes went flat for a breath, and Daniel's jaw flickered with that disappointment that insists it is worry. The next escalation was not a scene, but a drip. Stories began to travel faster than I did, and I would arrive somewhere and find a version of myself already present. A man who forgets to turn off burners, a man who confuses his medications, a man who misplaced a check that Daniel had to personally retrieve from the post office. And each time I tried to correct the record, I was told, with kindness, that it happens, that no one was judging, that I shouldn't take it so personally. Yet every invented lapse landed like a small stone on the same side of the scale until balance became performance, and the act of living turned into a demonstration that I was not the caricature being circulated. At church, a friend touched my arm and asked if I had someone staying with me yet, because Kelsey mentioned you'd been a little off lately, and the fact that she used Kelsey's name instead of Daniel's told me exactly who was carrying the script. Through the village. That afternoon I drove home by the long route and sat in my car in the driveway with my hands on the wheel and watched the late sun peel itself off the shingles. And I thought about how people can build a trap out of concern that looks like a rescue until you notice the door locks from the outside. When they came again, midweek this time, unexpected, the way managers show up on a shop floor to count, Daniel carried a small fireproof safe under his arm and said he had brought it for my important papers. And while I was still thanking him, trying to be the man my wife would want me to be, he asked for my Social Security card and my deed and my insurance binder, just to keep it all in one place. And I felt the old teacher in me rise like a spine being reset, and I told him those things would remain where they have always remained, within reach of the person to whom they belong, and he smiled as if I told a joke, and Kelsey tilted her head and said, We can do this the easy way or the stressful way, but either way, it needs to get done. And in that moment, something in the room changed the temperature. Maya, who had been on the sofa thumbing her phone, looked up and asked Kelsey if they were still going to the outlet mall after this, and Kelsey said yes as soon as he cooperates. Not unkindly, just with the efficiency of someone arranging. Luggage. And that was when I realized that my grandson and granddaughter were being taught in the most practical vocabulary, that I was an obstacle to be moved rather than a person to be met. After they left, I walked the perimeter of my house the way a farmer walks his fence after a storm, and I found a gate unlatched and a stack of mail that had been rearranged, and in the den the blue album was gone from the credenza, though the dust. Rectangle where it had lay still marked its absence like a chalk outline. The drawer of the desk that holds my spare checks had been shut too tightly, and when I opened it the paper edges were pressed into a small wave, and there on top, not where I leave it, lay my address book with its leather cracked like a dry riverbed, and a yellow sticky note with a number I did not recognize clung to back page, a number with no name that smelled like an open door in the wrong direction. I stood in the doorway a long time and let the house tell me what had changed, and though I could not prove it, I knew the story was advancing with or without my consent. The preparations were being made under the shining banner of help, and that, if I did not gather what was mine and hold it close the next time they came, they would arrive with something more official than tote bags and smiles. In the morning I took out my file box and reviewed slowly and with a kind of sacred pettiness every paper that says who I am, and I wrote the name of a lawyer from church on an index card and set it by the phone, and I made photocopies the way I used to make extra handouts for the kid in the back row who always forgot his notebook, because there is a kind of forgetting that is accidental, and there is a kind that is strategy, and I had begun to suspect which kind I was up against. I called Daniel that afternoon to propose we meet for dinner somewhere public and cheerful where the conversation might stay on the rails, and he agreed too quickly, and when I arrived at the restaurant he was already at a corner table with a ma'am. From his firm and 2 documents turned face down like cards in a game, and before the bread arrived his colleague said a cheerful thing about streamlining signatures for older clients. And Daniel said we could make this painless if I trusted him, and I said that love and trust are not the same as compliance, and his face tightened, and the waiter stood with a pad wanting to know if we would like sparkling or still, and it occurred to me that escalation does not always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it is the patient stacking of assumptions until, one day, you find yourself eating a meal at a table where the menu has been chosen for you, and you are expected to thank them for the privilege. The turning point came not with some thunderclap of confrontation, but with a dinner that should have been ordinary, one of those polite Sunday gatherings that once marked the rhythm of family life. And yet, by the time dessert plates were cleared, I felt that something irreversible had been spoken into existence. They had invited me, after weeks of distance, to join them at their home in the city, and though a voice inside warned me that this sudden gesture of inclusion had the cadence of a trap, another part of me, the softer part that still longed for what we once were, convinced me to go. I put on a jacket my wife had given me years ago, the elbows worn to a shine, and carried with me a tin of oatmeal cookies, because no visit should be empty-handed. And when I arrived, Kelsey opened the door with a smile that looked like it had been ironed onto her face, Daniel standing behind her with the guarded composure of a man preparing to litigate his own father. The meal began innocuously enough, polite talk about the children's schools, about Kelsey's committee work, about Daniel's firm landing a new client. And I listened, nodding where appropriate, offering small observations that fell to the table like pebbles in a deep well. But then, as the plates were being cleared, Daniel turned to me with that same lawyer's gravity he had used on the phone and said he needed to speak plainly. He told me in front of his wife and children that I was making life unnecessarily difficult by refusing to sell my house, that holding on to it out of sentiment was not only irrational but selfish, and that in doing so I was robbing him of the ability to secure a future for his own family. He said the words with a steady calm, but underneath I heard the verdict already pronounced, and when I tried to remind him that the house was more than lumber and shingles, that it was the vessel of his mother's life and our shared history, he shook. his head as though I were reciting folklore, and then came the sentence that sliced deeper than any of the previous skirmishes. If you can't let go of that place, then maybe you're not really part of this family anymore, because family supports each other. And right now you're standing in the way of us moving forward. The air in the room shifted, as if even the children recognized the cruelty in the declaration, though they stayed silent, their eyes flickering between screens and forks. But my own breath caught in my throat, and I stared at the boy I'd once carried on my shoulders across a field, the man whose diploma I had paid for with the marrow of my savings, and I heard him dismiss me with the cold efficiency of an executor closing an account. I managed to finish the meal, though every bite tasted of metal, and when dessert was offered, I declined, excusing myself to the small restroom where I gripped the sink and stared at the reflection of a man who had just been told he no longer belonged to the very lineage he had built. I lingered there until my pulse steadied, then returned to the table to find Daniel discussing mortgage rates as if nothing had been said, and when I rose to leave, Kelsey walked me to the door and said, with that same smooth smile, "We only want what's best for you," which landed on me not as reassurance but as a quiet threat, the suggestion that my definition of best was no longer valid. Driving home that night, I did not turn on the radio because I needed silence to hear the truth forming inside me, and the truth was that I was no longer being treated as a father or even as a man with agency, but as an obstacle to be managed, a relic to be quietly displaced. I thought of my wife's garden, of the lilacs she had planted, and how each spring their blossoms declared stubbornly that memory has a fragrance stronger than time, and I swore to myself that I would not surrender the ground she once touched, not for equity, not for convenience, not even for the brittle approval of a son who had decided I was expendable. Yet even in my defiance I felt the tremor of isolation, because the sentence, "You are not family," is not simply an insult, it is a severing of roots, and I knew that from this moment forward every conversation would carry the shadow of that. Disowning. The midpoint of our conflict had arrived. There would be no return to small reconciliations, no soft landing of compromise, only the long and bitter unraveling of what had once been the sacred fabric of kinship. Though I did not yet know the shape of what was coming, I understood in my bones that the battle was no longer about a house, but about the last scraps of dignity a man is allowed to keep when his own blood decides to erase him. The weeks that followed that dinner arranged themselves into a kind of brittle truce that fooled no one, least of all the house, which began to hold its breath as if waiting for a storm that had already been named, and I tried to live my days the way I always had, waking early and listening to the percolator spit and sigh, while dawn ironed the creases out of the maples beyond the porch. But even the coffee seemed to taste like reminders, and I found myself moving through rooms with the sensation that I was being watched by something other than the old photographs, as if the air itself had started keeping minutes of my habits, cataloging the way I stacked my mail and how long the bathroom light stayed on and whether I paused before choosing. The key to the back door, the first clear sign that the truce was an illusion, arrived folded in corporate politeness. The credit union left a message that there had been an attempt to open a home equity line secured by my address, and when I went down there with my worn leather folder and a resolve that felt like a stone in my pocket, the branch manager, a woman with kind eyes and the weary calm of someone who has seen many kinds of desperation, pulled up a screen and showed me an application that listed me as co-applicant along with Daniel, and stapled behind it was a photocopy of a durable power of attorney, bearing my name in a handwriting that looked like mine if you glanced quickly and didn't love me. The notary stamp belonged to a Lacey Moran, whose name rang a bell I couldn't place, and when I told the manager that I had never signed such a document, she leaned in and lowered her voice and said she believed me, that the signature had the strain of rehearsal. She printed everything and slid the papers across the desk as if handing me photographs from a battlefield, then locked the file and put a fraud alert on my account with the tidy efficiency of someone pushing back against a tide, with a broom and still managing to sweep. I walked out into the parking lot with the winter sun lying white across the hoods of cars, and for the first time since Daniel had said that sentence about not being family, I felt less like a man whose feelings had been hurt and more like a citizen who had been targeted, and the difference stiffened my spine. Still, I went home by the long route because I needed air, and when I reached my porch there was a pink slip tucked in the storm door bleeding, "Delivery attempted," and the next morning I stood in line at the post office while the radio in the back crackled a baseball score from last season, and the clerk handed me a thick envelope stamped certified, in a red that looked almost festive if you didn't read the return address, Montgomery County Probate Court. Inside, a petition as neat as a trap announced a hearing to determine my incapacity and appoint a guardian of my person and estate, the petitioner being my son, supported by an affidavit from a physician whose name I didn't know, a Dr. Abramson, who apparently had evaluated me at my son's request and found me to be inconsistent and unreliable in matters of self-care, finances, and judgment, and I stood at my kitchen counter with that language spread out under the yellow lamplight, and felt a heat rise in me that I recognized from long ago, the day I watched a student's paper get plagiarized by a boy who smiled when confronted because he knew his father could buy him a new reputation. I called the number listed for Dr. Abramson, and after 2 transfers reached a receptionist who said the doctor was a concierge specialist, affiliated with a family office, and when I asked how he had examined me without meeting me, she said that evaluations can be based on collateral information, and when I asked what collateral information meant, she said family reports and functional observations, and when I asked who precisely had provided those, the line went quiet long enough for me to hear the elevator in their building sigh, open and close, and then she said she couldn't disclose that, but that families often come to them in moments of crisis. I did not sleep that night, and when I finally dozed toward morning, I was woken by a knock that didn't wait for permission, and on my porch stood 2 uniformed officers with faces arranged into the bland concern people wear when they have decided what they will find. Someone, they said, had requested a wellness check because there had been reports of me leaving the stove on and wandering outside after midnight, and would I mind if they stepped in and had a look? I let them in because the only thing worse than being inspected is refusing to be inspected and thereby confirming the need, and I walked them through my kitchen with its clean stove knobs, my living room with its neat stack of bills paid and filed, my bedroom with a bed made the way my wife taught me, corners crisp as a folded flag, and I watched their shoulders loosen slightly as the evidence of a life in order contradicted the script they had been handed, yet humiliation still did its work, because nothing quite matches the sting of having to perform your competence for strangers who carry flashlights even in daylight. When they left with apologies that wore the shape of instructions, keep the phone nearby, maybe check the stove twice just to be safe, I sat at the table and stared at the certified envelope again until the words blurred, and I understood that I was not simply up against a son's temper, but against a machinery that wears a good suit. Dolores from 2 doors down knocked that afternoon and brought a lemon cake as if mercy could be slivered and served on a plate, and after the kind talk about weather and knees, she hesitated and then told me she had seen Kelsey and Daniel on my porch. The previous week, while I was at the pharmacy, Kelsey with a phone, taking careful pictures of the loose handrail and the chipped step and the throw rug that occasionally catches a heel, and she asked if I knew why they would do that, and I thanked her and changed the subject because there is only so much a man can admit out loud before the room tips. In the evening, the boy from across the street, Jonah, the one I helped fix a chain on his bike, came over with the restless kindness of the young and showed me on his laptop how court dockets are public, and there, glowing with the equal opportunity of the Internet, was my case, with documents downloadable like recipes, their petition, a letter from Maya's school counselor attesting that the grandchildren were concerned about Grandpa's confusion, a typed statement from Kelsey listing incidents that read like fiction with dates attached, and at the bottom a financial statement that sketched me not as a man but as an estate to be saved from itself. Jonah, who lives online the way fish live in rivers, clicked a few more times and pulled up a press release from Daniel's firm about an upcoming partner class, along with industry chatter on a legal blog noting the rumored buy-in figure that made my breath go sideways and the pieces snap together with the horrible satisfaction of a picture you had been refusing to see. The investment Daniel had mentioned, the sudden urgency, the talk of equity and leveraging assets, the willingness to cast. Me as incompetent, it all pointed not to my welfare but to a deadline that had nothing to do with my life and everything to do with his next wrong. I called Daniel with the papers all around me and spoke slowly because rage distorts syntax. And I told him what I had at the bank and what I had from the court and what I had learned about his firm. And he listened without interrupting the way. Lawyers listen for exploitable mistakes, and when I asked him if he had forged my name, he said he had done what he needed to do to protect the family. And when I told him that forging a parent's name is a crime even when you call it protection, he said I was overreacting and that if I would just sign the proper versions, all of this would be made clean. And when I asked him if he had arranged the wellness check, he said that when someone refuses reasonable help, you involve people who can persuade, and there it was, the pronoun that makes colds colder, someone. I told him I would see him in court if I had to, and he said, "You won't like what that looks like," and hung up. And I sat in the old chair my wife loved and remembered, a night 25 years earlier when Daniel had called from a payphone at 1 in the morning because he had been pulled over and had a bottle on the passenger seat that didn't belong to him, and how I had put on my coat over my pajamas and driven in the kind of silence in which fathers negotiate with their gods, and how I had paid a lawyer and another man and buried the incident under favors and shame, and how, when the dust settled, I told myself I had taught him a lesson about consequences, not understanding that the lesson he absorbed was different, that consequences were negotiable if you were the right person. The blows kept coming cotton-wrapped in procedure. My mailbox coughed up a notice that my homeowner's policy would be canceled for occupancy change, unless I confirmed certain details by a date that had already passed because the letter had been forwarded twice, and when I called the agent I learned that someone had submitted a change of address for me to Daniel's condo, which explained the missing property tax reminder, now carrying a penalty that felt designed to teach old men humility. And the agent, who had known my wife, lowered her voice and told me Kelsey had stopped by the office 3 days prior to make sure your file was up to date. I took to carrying my file folder with me like a pilgrim's icon and made lists on index cards, and began to collect affidavits from people who knew me in the ordinary, which is the only register that matters when someone is trying to rewrite you. The pharmacist who watches me count pills into a weekly box without error, the librarian who sees me request books and return them on time, the neighbor who knows I shovel my own steps at dawn before the city plows rumble through, the church treasurer who can attest that I reconcile the pantry receipts to the penny. I asked my doctor for a cognitive screen and aced the one with apples and triangles and the backward spelling of world. And the young woman giving the test looked embarrassed at the triviality of it, as if she had been sent to measure a river with a teaspoon, and she printed out a letter and shook my hand with more pressure than protocol required. In this fearful choreography there were still strange moments of grace that hurt because of their rarity. Maya texted one afternoon a picture of a painting from her art class, a little boat under a threatening sky, and asked what I thought, and I sent back too many words about color value and the way the horizon steadies fear if you paint it straight, and she wrote, "Thanks," with a heart, and then went silent again for a week. And I realized how much casual normal talk I would have accepted for the price of a single ordinary afternoon. But ordinary had been replaced by strategy. When I walked into the church hall for pancake breakfast, a woman from the parish committee took my elbow and asked in that syrupy tone people use when they want compliance if I had considered moving into a place with more support, and behind her smile I could see Kelsey's PowerPoint traveling from one cocktail table to the next, spreading a gospel of concern that sounded reasonable in rooms without context. On a Saturday, the day holding the solid red circle of the hearing date on the calendar, Kelsey pulled into my driveway without calling first, and came in with that tote of hers that seems to grow heavier when she intends to be persuasive. And she sat at my table and spoke softly about being tired of fighting and about the stress this was causing the kids, and about how she had found a lovely apartment for me in a senior building with a studio that faced a courtyard with a fountain, and she slid across the table, a lease with the lines already initialed in pale pencil where she thought my hand should go, and when I told her that I would not sign away my life to spare her a hard month, she let the smile go and said, in a voice that finally matched the weather of her work, that if I wanted to do this the humiliating way, then so be it, and that she and Daniel would walk into that courtroom with stories that would make even the kind judge look at me with pity, and that she had never lost. A case built on pity. I asked her then, because I had to, how it felt to dismantle the man who had given her husband a father to lean on, and she stared at me with an impatience that made her look suddenly very young, and said that life is a chain of practical decisions, and that the people who hesitate are the ones who get hurt. And I knew then that whatever tenderness had once lived between us had been foreclosed with penalties. That night, while I sorted documents into stacks that the lawyer recommended, medical, financial, character, daily living, I found the blue leather photo album in the bottom of a box where it did not belong, a thin smear of grit on its spine, and, tucked between the pages, a sticky note in a neat hand that was not mine that said, "Preserve evidence of confusion, misdated holiday," pointing to a picture of my wife in a red sweater under a banner that said, "Mary," the year written in my ballpoint as 2003 when it was truly 2002. The sort of small error a man makes on a night of grief and then fixes later with a gentle laugh, and seeing it labeled as pathology made me feel a cold so profound it seemed to travel through the bone into the chair. I closed the album and set it aside and told the empty room that if they wanted a villain they would have to be braver than this, and I placed the sticky note in the trash and pressed it down with my palm as if sealing a letter I refused to mail. The phone rang once at midnight, then stopped, and in the morning I found footprints on the dew of the back steps that were not mine, as though someone had come to harvest another detail to use against me, and I swept the steps slowly because I wanted to remember the sound of a broom in a world that still made sense. In the old wooden desk where my wife kept recipes, I found the only thing I had not thought to look for, because shame tends to hide itself in familiar containers, a file with the word tuition written in her looping hand, papers from the year Daniel nearly lost his scholarship because he turned in a paper too polished to be his, a professor's letter where she speaks of giving him another chance, after meeting with a guardian, I, the guardian, who promised oversight and a plan, and the bank. Statement that showed the small second mortgage we took to bridge that semester until I could pick up summer classes and make it right, and I sat with those pages and felt neither triumph nor devastation, only an old weariness, because the story I had to tell in court would not be the story of a saint wronged by an ungrateful son, but of a father who had already once taught his boy that rules were suggestions, and that love could be counted on to change the numbers. I slid the file into my folder anyway, not to accuse, but to explain to myself the contour of the road that had led us here, and I wrote on an index card in the careful print I use when I want to leave no room for misreading. Dignity is not a negotiable instrument. By the time the week turned and the courthouse doors loomed, I had been inspected, photographed, petitioned, downgraded, warned, and gently slandered by people who claimed to be worried for me and the house. Stubborn old thing that it is, held its shape around me like a pair of hands cupped against the rain, and I realized that their motive, whatever numbers had driven it, had found its perfect disguise in the rhetoric of care. That is the vicious genius of this kind of betrayal. It dresses itself in your favorite words. It tells you it is saving you from yourself. It uses your own caution and patience as proof against you. And when you object, it calls you unreasonable, and when you resist, it calls you ill. On the morning I gathered my folder and backed the car out of the driveway, I looked once at the garden my wife had loved and felt the air shift like a stagehand pulling a rope, and I told her out loud, because sometimes the dead respond through our steadiness, that I would carry her house and her name through whatever courtroom Daniel had built for us, and that if I could not keep both, then I would at least keep the one thing that had not yet been itemized on a spreadsheet, which was the stubborn, unpurchasable knowledge of who I am. The morning of the hearing broke clear and thin as glass, the kind of Ohio blue that feels freshly unwrapped, and I drove downtown with my file box belted into the passenger seat like a fragile passenger, rehearsing the plainness of what I intended to say, because truth does not require embroidery, only air. And when I walked through the metal detectors at the Montgomery County Probate Court, the bailiff nodded with a kindness that steadied my hands, and my attorney, quiet, meticulous, a man from church who understands the stubborn grammar of dignity, met me in the hallway and asked if I was ready, then added, almost like a prayer, that the judge was fair and had a good ear for what is genuine and what is staged. Inside, the room smelled faintly of varnish and paper, and Daniel sat at the petitioner's table with Kelsey angled toward him like a shield, both of them dressed in a dark neutrality that suggested good sense, civic duty, the costume people wear when they want power to look like compassion. I took my seat with my file open and the affidavits stacked until their edges were flush, and when the clerk called our case, the sound of my name echoing in that room brought back 1,000 roll calls from classrooms where attendance meant belonging, and I understood with a clarity that matched the light outside that this day would decide whether my life would continue to be mine or be managed for me by the child I raised. Daniel spoke first with the ease of a man who believes that if he organizes words into an orderly procession, the world will fall into step, and he told the judge I had become forgetful and impulsive, that I left burners on, wandered after midnight, signed checks twice, trusted strangers, and distrusted my own son, and he lifted his hands once in a gesture of wounded reason. When he said that asking the court for guardianship was an act of last resort, born of love, Kelsey's eyes shone at the corners at the exact calibrated moments, and for a second I saw how convincing our undoing would look to someone who did not know the temperature of our house. My attorney asked only a few questions, delicate little taps at the structure Daniel had built. Had he ever actually seen a burner left on? Did he possess a dated photograph? Could he name the pharmacist who had expressed concern? Daniel's answers turned soft around the edges. He had heard, he had been told, he had it on good authority. And then came the part his voice couldn't keep sweet, the durable power of attorney he produced as if offering a lifesaver to a drowning man. And when my attorney slid it to the judge and then to me, the room seemed to tilt, because there, under a notary stamp belonging to one Lacey Moran, was my name written in a version of my hand that had been pressed from a memory, the loops tight where mine travel, wide, the crossbar on my T perched too high as if careful fingers had reached for it from a distance. The judge asked when and where the document had been executed, and Daniel answered with a date that will live in my bones and a location that I recognized as a cafe I have never entered, and when the judge inquired after Ms. Moran, she was not that day available, though Kelsey volunteered that Ms. Moran had moved practices, which is a euphemism you use when a person has vanished. When it was my turn, I did not try to match their rhetoric, because I have learned that a steady voice can carry more freight than a loud one, and I told the judge that I am 78, and I make my coffee one careful cup at a time, that I still balance the ledger for our church pantry and return my library books on the day stamped, that I rise early because the house is most honest before the world begins talking, and I told him the word family has been used in these proceedings like a charm to justify trespasses that would shame strangers, and then I began placing my papers on the rail one by one, letting the judge and the room take their time with each. The letter from my physician stating that my cognition is intact and my blood. Pressure unremarkable, the affidavit from the pharmacist who watches me sort my week's pills and has never once seen me confused. The statement from Dolores 2 doors down describing how Kelsey photographed my loose handrail and welcome Matt like a claims adjuster searching a ruin she hopes to a file. I produced the bank manager's printouts showing the attempted haylock with my name attached, and the power of attorney submitted as proof, the fraud alert she filed while I sat in her office holding a paper that made my own letters look foreign, and then, because the truth often needs a small hinge to swing on, I asked permission to hand up a single photograph that Jonah, the boy across the street with a liking for the internet had found on a public social page a smiling snapshot taken 2 summers ago at a backyard wine night where Kelsey and the notary whose stamp lived on my forged document stood shoulder to shoulder with their heads tipped together, the caption hashtagging something harmless about my girls, and while friendship is no crime, the judge's gaze lingered on that image long enough to let me know he understood the gravity of casual proximity when signatures are at stake. Somewhere in the back a pen clicked twice and fell silent. Somewhere in the front row a cough tried not to be a laugh. I kept my eyes on the judge's hands because the hands tell you everything you need to know about what a person will do next. My attorney asked the court to note that the incidents Daniel had compiled lacked dates, details, and corroboration beyond family reports. And then he did something I will thank him for until I close my eyes on this world. He asked the judge to allow me to speak, not as respondent, but as a father. And the judge, who had been stern but not unkind, nodded, and I turned toward my son and told him that the night he called from a payphone and I came for him before his life hardened around one bad decision. I believed we were building a covenant that ran in both directions, that the house he now calls an obstacle was bought with my wife's ingenuity and my bent back and was meant to be a safe harbor, not a lever, and that if love means anything, at our age it means respecting the old fences that keep a man from being turned into a problem to be solved. I said that he told me I was not family anymore and that I had tried to make peace with hearing my life discounted by the mouth that once said, "Daddy," with milk on it. But that today, in this room, he had asked the law to finish the deletion and that I could not let him do that to me or to the memory of the woman who taught him to hold a fork and the truth at the same time. I told the judge that if the court found me incapable, I would accept it because institutions are not my enemies, but that it would have to do so on the facts of my life and not on a story designed to meet a financial deadline. There was a long, close quiet in which the only sound was the HVAC doing its practical breathing, and then the judge leaned forward and asked Daniel to approach with his original of the power of attorney, which my attorney had requested through discovery but had never received, and Daniel, who rarely looks unprepared, shuffled papers that refused to become the thing he needed, murmured about misplaced files, suggested that the notary kept the original, and somewhere in the repetition the word misunderstanding turned to ash. The decision, when it came, was spoken slowly and without theatrics, which made it feel more final. Petition denied, capacity affirmed, any further attempts to exercise authority under the disputed power of attorney enjoined. Matter referred to the county prosecutor for review of possible fraud, the court strongly advising the parties to reconsider the meaning of duty before returning with any new petitions. Kelsey's face held for a second the expression of someone who has just remembered a pot left on a high flame, and Daniel looked him for the first time in a long time, not angry but very young, as if the scaffolding of certainty had been bumped and he feared heights. My attorney placed a hand against my shoulder blade, a steadying pressure that told me it was over, and yet the climax of that day was not the judge's ruling or the murmured rustle of the room. When the word prosecutor was spoken, it was what happened in the hallway, where the light from the high windows fell like mercy and revealed dust floating in the air like a reminder of the ordinary. Daniel followed me out, said my name not as an accusation but as a summons, and asked if we could talk, just the two of us. And I turned because a father never fully renounces the impulse to turn when he hears his child in pain. He began with the sentence men use when shame skates near truth. This got away from me. And I answered with the sentence I had been practicing in my head for months, that love is not a quarterly target and that there are lines you cannot cross, not because the law forbids it, but because your soul does. And then I told him the thing I had not wanted to say, that the will I wrote after his mother died had been rewritten, and that he would not find his name there anymore, not out of cruelty, but clarity, and that the money his mother and I saved would go to a scholarship for the kind of kids I used to teach who need a hand without strings, and to the church pantry that believes hunger is everyone's business, and to a small trust for the neighbor boy who fixed his bike in my driveway because he remembers to knock. I told him that the door to my house was not locked against repentance, but that repentance, like every honest thing, requires time and evidence, and that, until then, I would keep my life where it belonged, with me. He said something about partners and timelines and how none of it was supposed to turn into this, and I said that the moment he looked at me and saw equity rather than history, this ending began. And then I did the loudest thing a man can do in a quarrel that has eaten his life. I stopped speaking. I walked out of the courthouse into a noon that felt new. The sun making a statement on the hood of my car, the pigeons doing their unbothered commerce on the steps, and I set the file box gently on the seat and drove home the long way so I could pass the high school where I taught and the little library where Miss Angela pretends not to notice when I read the papers before buying them, and when I turned onto my street, the maples threw a shade that looked like something chosen for me, rather than left over for me, and Dolores waved from her porch with a dish towel in her hand as if blessing a procession. Inside the house I made coffee, 3 scoops, water just under boiling, a pinch of salt the way my wife swore it drew the bitterness down, and I carried the mug into the garden where the lilacs had begun to hint at their violet intent, and I sat in the old chair and told my wife out loud what had happened, that the law had put its hand between me and my son, and that a long, necessary quiet would follow, that I had not won so much as I had refused to lose myself, and I promised her that the little money we harvested from years of saying no to pretty things would go to children whose parents might not sit in courtrooms but who still deserve a future. And the wind moved through the leaves with a sound like pages turning, and for the first time in a long season I felt the world consent to my presence without asking for a signature. I learned, in the weeks after the courthouse emptied and the hallway swallowed our last words, that endings don't arrive with trumpets, but with errands, so I went about the quiet labor of keeping my life mine, tightening the loose handrail Kelsey had photographed with such care, moving the throw rug that caught a heel, labeling my pillbox in letters so unapologetically large they read like a headline only I needed to see, and sitting with my attorney to make the arrangements that turned fear into paper, a will that no longer mistook sentiment for prudence, a small scholarship in my wife's name for the sort of first-generation kids I used to teach who show up early and stay late, a modest gift pledged to the pantry because hunger seldom waits, for committees, and a neutral fiduciary named in case one day my memory does, in fact, fray. Not because anyone says so, but because time has its own unarguable grammar. I told my lawyer I did not wish to be the old man who guards his biography like a bank vault, and yet I would not be the old man who signs away his breath to make someone else's deadline gentler. And he nodded the way a careful man nods when a sentence lands true. The house steadied under me the way a faithful animal settles after a storm, and I let the days resume their honest choreography. Coffee measured the way she taught me, a sweep of the porch at 10, a drive to the library where Miss Angela pretends not to notice that I read every headline before I buy the paper, until the phone rang one afternoon and a woman from the county prosecutor's office asked in a voice that respected the weight of what she was asking whether I would be willing to provide a statement about the document I had testified to and the notary whose stamp had appeared where my hand had not. And I said I would, not with glee, not with vengeance, but with the same patient accuracy I once used to grade papers, because the truth is, not a weapon so much as a weight that, set down, allows the table to be level again. Time, being practical, kept moving, and the season turned the maples the precise color my wife used to hold up against her cheek when we chose paint for the dining room, and in that yellow month Dolores knocked with a casserole, and the gossip she never calls gossip, saying she had heard at choir that the notary had stepped back from her commission pending review, a sentence that sounded like a polite curtain being drawn, that Daniel's firm had scrubbed his photograph from the neat little grid announcing their partner class and added a line about a leave to attend to personal matters, and while rumor is a dumb instrument and I have no appetite for courtroom sequels, I allowed myself the smallest breath of what I can only call unshowy justice. I did not write Daniel to twist the knife, because when a man has tied his own tourniquet, your job isn't to pull on it, but to keep your side of the street swept. Once, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain, I found the blue leather album on my porch in a plain grocery bag with no note, only the careful placement of the thing itself. A kind of apology, written in objects, and though my first thought was, Kelsey, because she likes to put endings where they can be seen, Dolores swore she had caught a glimpse of Maya's ponytail ducking down the steps an hour before, and that night I opened the album to the page where a sticky note had once called my misdated holiday evidence of confusion and found tucked at that very spot. A torn strip of lined paper with a single sentence that managed to lift and press at once. I'm trying to learn how not to be cruel to the people I love, and it wasn't signed. But a 13-year-old's angles had softened into something recognizably hopeful, so I copied my address in a hand that would not frighten a child and left an envelope on the porch box marked, "For M, whenever," inside a letter that said, "No one has to choose sides to tell the truth, and that a grandfather is a patient animal by design." A week later it was gone, and in its place a small watercolor of lilacs leaned against the rail, the horizon steady and straight, the way I once told her it should be when skies are threatening. Holidays arrived with their stern cheer, and I spent them with the small republic that had made room for me without speeches. The pantry volunteers who tell better jokes than comedians and keep a ledger that would impress any auditor. Jonah from across the street, who now insists on being paid in lasagna for every computer tangle he untangles, and who came one Saturday with a shovel and a plan for cutting back the old lilacs so they could breathe. Miss Angela, who slid across the counter of the Form for the first Evelyn Grant Memorial Scholarship and winked as if she were handing me a passport to a country I had thought closed. The first recipient, a boy with shy wrists and an iron GPA, wrote a thank you in blue ink that wandered a little on the lines and ended with a promise to come by and fix my storm door before spring. Wind started bossing the neighborhood again, and I sat with that letter at the kitchen table and cried the kind of quiet that rinses a man more than it empties him. Daniel wrote once near Thanksgiving, a message, with the formal sorrow of a lawyer who knows when a record is being built, and he offered the word miscalculation, where another man might have offered repentance, and he asked if, for the sake of the children, we might put this behind us. And I answered like a man who knows the difference between a gate and a revolving door, that the past had not misplaced itself behind us, but sat plainly between us, and that while my door was not nailed shut, I would not step across the threshold of any conversation that did not begin with the names of what had been done, and an accounting that did not pretend paperwork is a synonym for love. I said the prosecutor might want a fuller version of what had happened, and that I had already given mine, and that if he wished to give his, he should do it to the proper office before trying to do it in my kitchen. And then I put the kettle on and let silence do the grown-up work of boundaries. The house, loyal creature, kept teaching me its old language. I fixed the squeak in the back step with a screw my wife had once tucked into a button tin. I repainted the porch rail the exact weathered white she claimed looked like a hymn. I mended the torn screen that had made the kitchen a casual club for moths, and in the mornings I read the paper on the stoop and waved to neighbors the way men in towns have waved for 100 honest years, and every so often a car I knew from another life would idle at the corner and then drive on, because some people learn first to circle and only later to stop. I did a thing that might sound petty if you've never had to grow new edges at 78. I made a list of the small, ordinary truths that no petition could replace. How I like my coffee, that I own my Tuesday chores, that my name remains mine even if someone else writes it down. And I taped it to the inside of the cupboard beside the mugs, a private constitution, for a household that had survived an attempted coup. And on Sundays I took the slow pew by the aisle so I could leave, if grief came. Sudden and rude, though most weeks it arrived as a soft animal that curled at my feet while the choir sang. When the prosecutor's office called again, it was only to thank me and say the review was ongoing, words that mean the wheels are turning somewhere out of sight, and I told the woman I wished no harm on anybody, only that the message go out into the world that fathers are not checking accounts, and that families who bend the word care until it becomes a bolt cutter should learn that doors, too, can be repaired and locked by the person who lives behind them. She said she understood, and I believed her because her voice had that grain of weariness people get from sitting with other people's damage and not confusing it with their own. Spring came late and then all at once, as Midwestern springs love to do, and one morning I stepped into a backyard perfumed with the precise stubbornness of my wife's lilacs, and between the bushes I saw a figure I recognized from 100 small distances, Maya with a backpack and a way of standing that said she was ready to run if the air turned wrong, and I called to her softly and told her she didn't have to choose any words she didn't bring herself, and she handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in the looping hand of someone who has practiced on notebook covers, and inside was a single page that said she was sorry about the way things had been said in that dining room, and that she didn't know yet how to be brave in a house where a story is told before breakfast and punished by dinner if you contradict it. And would I please keep the album safe, because she could not stand to see it used as a tool. I told her I would, and I told her that even if her father never stepped into this yard again, she would never be disowned by the garden, that was the complicated blessing of blood. It stains, and it sustains. And she smiled a small, practical smile that made me think of her grandmother's way of measuring flour, with her palm and saying, "That's enough." And then she left in the direction of the bus stop like a person walking between weather systems. On the evening light slid down the banister and made the old wood gleam as if it had been newly oiled. I put the album back on the credenza where it belongs. I poured a cup of coffee that would never taste exactly like my wife's, and loved it anyway. And I understood that when my son said I was not family anymore, he meant that I was no longer useful to the empire he had imagined, and that by refusing to become a province I had not lost a kingdom but recovered a home. It is a smaller realm, to be sure, governed by Tuesday lists and a scholarship check signed with careful hands, but it is sovereign. And on the nights when the wind pushes at the windows, I speak aloud into the rooms and tell the woman who taught me how to make a life out of ordinary ingredients that I kept the house, that I kept my name, that I kept the album, that the lilacs have forgiven us both for everything we forgot and everything we remembered too hard, and that the part of me that used to be busy proving I belonged can now simply sit at last and belong.